Peter.
Well, I've got half an hour to summarise a meeting where we heard from people like David Skilling, Sam Johnson, Peter Crisp, Anne Salmon, Jackie Bay, Derek Hanley, Suana Pamaka, Wayne Nata, to name but a few. So I might as well give up now. And I don't want to lose the good positive vibes that are in this room, but in summing up, I do need to bring a level of reality to the conversation and call a spade, so forgive me. I have one positive image in my mind and one frightening image. The positive image was those kids at Uawa School, at Uawa the other day. I mean, that was a remarkable image. The unacceptable thought is, what about all those other kids elsewhere in New Zealand? And think about where so many of them are going to be in a decade's time, unless things change. The question which we came together at the inspiration of Paul was, how can science, the power of the mind, and scholarship help make this country achieve some generally held goals? Economic prosperity, a high standard of living for all, greater social cohesion, and achieving that necessary economic growth without significant harm to our environment. It's a hard issue, and it's an issue which is interesting because I think in historical terms we're seeing a change in Western societies in our attitudes to the environment, which is not dissimilar to the change that happened at the end of the 18th century, beginning of the 19th century, in Western societies and our attitude to other human beings. When we eradicated slavery, when we started recognising the beginnings of social welfare, that we're now recognising that the planet also needs similar attention. But we also have to remember that we live in a world where concepts of consumerism mean little to billions of people. And we can expect another 2 to 3 billion people on the planet who need to be fed, housed, use energy and water in coming decades, who themselves need greater access to the world's resources. Just because we're in the South Pacific does not mean we're going to be immune from these challenges, which have a real geopolitical risk not too far from our horizons if they're handled badly. This meeting was different to past discussions in New Zealand on knowledge and innovation, in that I think it is a true hybrid forum. Scientists, scholars, leaders from other fields and members of the community and public are here and have been engaged in a proper dialogue. I think we've been trying to eradicate the concept of the two cultures, at least in the terms that C.P. Snow used them. I think we know that we made some progress, but we've got a way to go here, and that in itself is not surprising. Things take time to change. In a sense, this meeting has no authority beyond itself. We're just a collection of 300 New Zealanders out of a country of 4.5 million people. It started a dialogue and accelerated conversations, but what it can do is create, what's gone off the slide now, a bottom-up process which will accelerate change. So let me go back to the beginning of this meeting. We know that we start from a base of being small, geographically remote, multicultural, and both biologically and economically increasingly seeing ourselves as part of the Asia-Pacific, not of Europe. We rehearsed earlier in the meeting some of the advantages and disadvantages of our size and our geography. And one of the disadvantages we focused on is the need that we tend to look at ourselves somewhat negatively and introspectively. We do need to deal with our internal parochialism. We do need to become clever at self-diagnosis. But intellectualism, thinking in isolation from the community, will have no impact. The need for public intellectualism, the need to be inclusive, to value ideas and knowledge, is something this society has yet to do. As somebody this morning said, serious countries treat ideas seriously. Are we yet at that point? Sam pointed out the problem of our escaping. And I still wonder why we still celebrate those who leave New Zealand and succeed more than those who stay in New Zealand and succeed. That's really provincial. He also pointed out that under crisis we can create creative collegiality. Murray Bain pointed out that we haven't had that sinking ship under us, that burning ship, but he did point out that we're slowly sinking. We also need to understand how others see us. The world is not flat, it's lumpy. Clean and green serves us well in some quarters. But as Peter Crisp reminded us yesterday, we're off the radar as being innovative and aggressive in research and development. And certainly from my experience in Asia, that matters a hell of a lot more in thinking about how we grow business. Indeed, although we once had a reputation as a testbed for innovation, we've lost it. The other point, which was not emphasised, but I will make it now because it came up in different contexts, is our biggest asset in the world is we're corruption-free. We have high levels of integrity in our business, in our political system, in our manufacturing system, in our food safety systems, and that integrity is our biggest asset of all in the world of commerce. It's something we must not lose. Ideas do not respect distance, and so the challenge is how do we rebuild the reputation as a laboratory of innovation and rebuild that brand alongside the Clean Green and other brands we have. Now I want to deal with some important philosophical matters that have emerged. The concept of post-normality I raised in my introduction, that we now deal with a lot of complex systems where facts are uncertain, science has a lot to add, decisions may be made, but the issues are of a high public interest. Jez Weston added to that concept of post-normality really applies to everything from policy to economics and everything else. We are dealing in a much more complex world, which in itself is probably a reflection of the role of the internet, the role of the way in which many more domains come together in decision-making processes. The second point I want to raise is the one of language. We had discussions about trade-offs, balance, ecosystems. Effectively, they're all saying the same thing. I suspect some try to avoid the word trade-off because it's emotionally harder to accept than saying balance or equilibrium. But trade-offs are real at every level in a system which is closed at some level, be it from the planetary level to the individual level. And Gareth Morgan made it very clear yesterday that the reality is that our personal choices and what we do in our lives are effectively made on prioritising family and jobs first and trading off against other things, no matter how much we believe in them. Trade-offs, equilibrium, balance, whatever word you want to use, are often portrayed as binary. More of this, less of that. But actually it's much more complex than that, as those of you who are engineers or evolutionary biologists such as myself know. What we're looking for in New Zealand, as in anything else, is the optimal solutions to multiple demands simultaneously, where the settings on any one priority affect the settings on other priorities. Optimization does not mean that one thing ends out as being the maximum and others are made the minimum. Optimization means finding the best compromises, the best balance, best trade-offs, whatever word you want to use, between the various competing demands. I could extend the evolutionary metaphor to say that being a fast adapter is a good way to survive in a changing world. But that requires science and a capacity to assess new technologies quickly. And that, as we heard yesterday, requires far better communication between science, scholars, and the public if we're to accept and understand how to use and how to limit new technologies as they come on board. The third point I want to make is about pragmatism. Policy making is complex, and the democratic system we've created in New Zealand, rightly or wrongly, does not allow big bangs easily. What we need to do is work out how to promote a more rapid adaptive process within our economy using rapid incrementalism, right, because we're not going to get a big bang. Now coming to some of the other themes, and I'm not going to dwell on the length because they've been so well rehearsed here that, we could all hold hands and sing Kumbaya about them. Connectedness, communication, and relationships. We heard so much about that at every level, and we can talk about it. Amongst ourselves, the scientific community has to reflect on itself and how it reaches out and creates a real dialogue with the community, not a patronising communication with the community. Within New Zealand, I was inspired about some of the words I heard yesterday about partnership versus moving to relationship. I think that had a lot that resonated with me. And our international relationships. Relationships amongst people take time and energy. We all know that in our personal relationships. It's no different in business. It's no different between countries. It's no different between academia and communities. And as David Skilling made clear this morning, we do need, and Craig Neville Manning, we do need to invest in building those international relationships. We've got to work hard to be relevant to the world. Nobody needs us as much as we need them. The relationship is not equal, except in the case of some of the small Pacific Island states which are dependent upon us. Science is increasingly becoming a major tool of diplomacy. 40% of my time is now spent on diplomatic efforts. That is a sign of how important science is to establishing our relevancy to the world. We've heard lots of things about it, sabbaticals, etc., trying to stop the media criticising our ministers and others for travelling overseas. Peter Griffin reminded us of the opportunities to be a test bed for the world. But why have we lost the attractor to be that test bed? Because we've lost the focus on being innovative. We've got to come back to that and value it. We have lost the ability to attract multinationals, and anybody who understands innovation systems around the world will know that you can't live without them if you want to create an innovation ecosystem. We talked about the media. Some things good, a lot bad, the issues of balance and reporting as a form of bias, particularly on controversial issues, the challenge of creating new informed discourse, and the challenge of the new forms of media, which for people who are still in decision-making power are largely remote from those sources of media. That's a challenge that we've got to think about. We talked about silos and structures in the science system and in the scholarship system, university system in general. Far too many barriers between disciplines. We've got a structure in our university funding system with PBRF, structures in our science funding systems, which create far too much micro-definition, which devalue bright ideas in relationship to just getting on and doing the next logical thing. We need to promote rotation between domains in the sciences and humanities, and as much as we do rotation between scientists and policy, scientists and business. I have a scholar of history and philosophy of science within my own biological science group. How many others do? This is where we should be moving. I want to come back to the theme of integrity, because I think this is very important. New Zealand's reputation for integrity sells, I think, in the world more than anything else. We build it into the clean and green brand, but it's far deeper than that. Sustainability is growing in concept, but in a world of food, water and energy insecurity, We need to understand how much the integrity of our systems of food safety, of quality assurance in what we do, really is what sells. And underneath all that is the issue, another theme of integrity that emerged, which is the integrity of the science process. We need to protect at all costs the integrity of science and keep values out of the processes of undertaking research and interpreting the data. It's not easy to do, and the issues of perceived conflict will rise as there's greater association between science and business. But we've got to work hard at it. Equally, I might tell you that from a political point of view, academics have many conflicts of interest which we don't ourselves recognise. How often are we behaving in our relationships to other academics to protect our own funding streams or to protect our own priorities in the publication light? Politicians see those conflicts of interest. We often don't. They're just not as adverse. I want to make a comment about scientific advice. When scientific advice gets beyond the data and the evidence and becomes issues driven, it has little more validity than that of any other issue group. The pressure, if we can keep science focused on the knowledge base, it will be far more effective in informing decisions of government. There was another thing that came up, which the issues of scale. Somebody said we do big badly. We have started to understand that we need to do small really well, and that's different to doing big badly. But that may mean a number of uncomfortable decisions about things, and we need to understand and work on how we do that. We have to find our own path ahead. We can't copy anybody else's path. Gareth Porgan, and I think that is the key thing that we're seeing in this room. I think some of the things we heard from Wayne Nata, from some of the other people in this room, show that there are really, really genuine ways in which New Zealand can find its own path ahead. There's the issue of Auckland. It was raised. I'm from Auckland, so I better shut up at this point. But I think the issues that were raised of scale yesterday morning in particular, and the need to understand that to have the capacity to compete needs the capacity to create those synergies and scale. Yes, we need Auckland, but yes, we need all of New Zealand to be linked into a 4.5 million person city, even though it's spread over 1,000 miles. I want to deal with a couple of other matters. There's some elephants in the room, and I'm going to address those in a moment, and I'm going to run out of time very quickly because you lot were late. An advanced economy must be committed to generating frontier knowledge to be competitive and value innovation. Sean Henry yesterday pointed out the high-tech space where we could do a lot more, where we had some capacities, but he also pointed out how few big companies we actually have. Perhaps we need to see ourselves as not New Zealand Inc., but part of Asia Inc. Perhaps we need to recognise that to succeed, we are part of a bigger ecosystem where we can do some things well, but to do things that will make us a lot of money, we need to partner beyond our shores. We've done that to a certain extent in one or two areas, but mainly in the basic science area like the Square Kilometre Array and the Global Research Alliance. Should we be doing it more in the innovation sector? Several speakers and comments spoke to the high potential in agriculture, and it would be misleading if we left here thinking that the primary sector is either low technology or saturated in its capacity to add to the New Zealand economy. The challenge will be, which is purely scientific, is how to get increased productivity from our farms, from our gardens, without further harming within the available environmental constraints. We've heard that we don't do sufficient economic research about ourselves. We've heard a lot from the Maori community, and wasn't it refreshing to see that they see themselves as an integral and essential and true partner in an innovation system for New Zealand. They show a maturity of understanding that innovation and thinking as part of their future within their own cultural identity without rejecting the potential of modern science. But there are some big challenges here. Where there's been empowerment, things have obviously happened. Look at Tolaga Bay. They have enormous creative potential, but we've heard about the issues of science, technology and education and mathematics education, all of which is deficient for far too many Maori in Pacifica. We heard a challenge yesterday which we did not have time to address, and it was not the right room to address it in, about the tikanga, about collective versus individual decision making, about how that marries with the adoption of new technologies, and a much larger conversation is needed on these issues. And I've committed as my action plan to work with Charles Royal to have a hui specifically on that matter with more people in the room to discuss it. We heard a lot about the environment, but we didn't hear about how science can help you with the environment. And I think there's a lot that science can do to help you with the environment. We need to understand more about perceptions of risk and risk management. We need a discussion, as Chris Mace pointed out, based on knowledge. And as Gareth Morgan pointed, the problem of decisions made on the basis of entrenched, uninformed views will always lead to risks being assessed emotionally, not necessarily rationally. But that should not deny the importance of one's emotions in making decisions. Merely, it should be that they should be made, your emotions should respond to the knowledge and the real knowledge about what we know and what we don't know. Then our emotions have an important part to play. Surprisingly, there was no discussion on the science of conservation biology, especially in the light of climate change. We did not discuss the issues of whether ecosystems or species were where to focus. We did not discuss how we define areas to conserve scientifically. We did not discuss the issue of the effort we put into non-viable species versus the effort that we should put into species that are at risk. Those are issues that do need further discussion because science could offer you so much in those areas. We had a lot this morning about people, and in the interest of time, I have to really move fast. Renee pointed out the need to understand our people even before they're conceived. Sam reminded us what the real future of New Zealand is. I think we're all just so impressed with you, Sam, and your colleagues, just as we're all impressed with those 10-year-old kids from Tolaga Bay on Wednesday. Soane reminded us of the importance and the essentiality of inclusiveness. Please do a sabbatical in Glen Innes, or I suspect in Uawa. You'll be equally welcome. The importance of educational research, done well, is important. And if I can go off the record for a minute, you will see in the last week the disaster of not doing good educational research. But we've got to think about the issues of how we create better science literacy for the population and improve that as a whole. Science in isolation on its pedestal is no longer valid. Jackie's Bay's great initiative is all informal, funded by philanthropy, not necessarily supported by her administrative hierarchy. How many other of these feral programs relating science from the science community to the community as a whole are in a similar position? Perhaps that's something we should all be thinking about. How do we actually institutionalise and make sure that this stuff cannot continue to just be happenstance based on whether there's a philanthropist around next week to deal with the missing $50,000 or not? I could Jackie's point about the problems of the secondary tertiary interface is real and something which we did not have time to discuss. Paul said this is the place, we want to be the place where talent wants to live. Well, think about that hard. There is a global competition for the innovator, the scientist, and the entrepreneur, and we have to make a climate which values risk takers, values scientists, values intellectuals if they're going to come and stay here. We've started to talk about the culture of mentorship. And if you look back, make an advertisement for my blog site on my website, you'll see me talking about what I learned in Canada, about how in Waterloo, about how mentorship really creates innovation ecosystems. So where do we go where it goes? Where do we go from here? In my introductory remarks, I listed the many facets of science, from its role just as science to advance and expand the human mind, through to science, which drives business-led innovation through either building on what we already do good, well at, or what we could add to and do better where we have a competitive advantage. I think in the course of the meeting we heard arguments for every one of the many categories of science I listed. But yet our combined public and private sector spend on R&D is 30% of that of all our comparator countries. That's a profound statement. If we really want to be one of the small, clever countries in the world, what do we need to do to change that investment in the future? Because the issue is science and scholarship a necessary precursor to growth, which I think most of us in this room agree it is, or is science and scholarship a luxury of rich countries? We've tended to treat it as the latter. We can no longer afford to do so. Why is it that New Zealand has not, over 3 decades, responded to the shift which other advanced nations have made in that direction? Why is it we've not been prepared to make the trade-offs that other countries have been prepared to make in that direction? Because we've not made the case for it out of this room. Scientists have been in their ivory towers, they've been interested in funding their own interested. Our business has not been well connected to science, our community has not been well invested in science. Connectedness and conversation remain at the heart of the challenge. You realise that the major newspaper in the major country, in the major city in this room, in this country, has not even reported this meeting. So think about it. So what do? We heard, the other point I'd make before moving to my final remarks is we heard a lot about the need to simplify the system, to focus on interdisciplinarity. It should be an advantage in a small system. It ain't now. We've got to work out how to change the system. There are system changes that need. I think science in New Zealand has lost its scholarship. It's become focused on empiricism and lost the point of ideas generation and scholarship. Alan, when are we posting the blog about that? Next week? And next week we're posting a blog about that as well. So what do we do? How do you extend from what's happening at Uawa to the hundreds of communities when our academic community itself is overloaded? There's bottom-up things to do. Connectedness, communication, inclusiveness. There's a need for a step change from the bottom up and top down. There are in New Zealand many key players who still believe that innovation does not need science and does not need intellectualism. There are key players who believe that innovation comes from business, not from science and not from research. You guys have a role to change that. An enormous role to play. How many of you have ever met your MP and talked about science? How many of you have ever written to an MP? Sweet bugger all, to be honest, looking around the room. How many of you are going to write to your MP after this meeting or talk to your MP about after this meeting? MPs are human. They're responding to electoral processes. They respond to emails. They respond to to conversation. Get involved, please. We've relied far too much on a small number of people like Sir Paul. That's why we failed. Not because Sir Paul wasn't great, but because it's been a very small number of people communicating with the group in policy-making positions. The value of discovery science has not been supported in New Zealand by the business community. To what extent that's the business community's fault, to what extent it's the science community's fault, I don't want to get into, but both better change their behaviours. We need to remind people at the end of something that Bridget Ogilvie, the late director of the Wellcome Trust, said when she got an honorary degree at the University of Auckland. Second-rate research is a waste of money. At the beginning of the day, if the research is not of excellence, let's not do it. And let's get a lot more elitist of making sure the research we do truly is good enough to have an impact on New Zealand, have an impact on the world. That is where the role of science is to be, whether it's at the discovery end of science or the stuff that's going to go to Google or anybody else to use and apply. Where are the op-eds? How many of you have ever written an op-ed and submitted it to a paper about the role of science and innovation? Again, Paul, myself, a few in this room. Think about it. That's my plea. I can do so much, but I'm just one person giving advice to one person. Paul was one person who had a remarkable skill at communicating to the community, and for that we're all grateful. But, as I said at the beginning, and Wayne Nata said this morning, we all have to find our own path for the future for Aotearoa, New Zealand. And it's we. It's not me, it's we. And that, I think, is the point of this meeting, that if we really want to make New Zealand a small, clever nation which is relevant to the world, we can no longer be satisfied with how we use science and knowledge. We've heard enough in the last 3 days, because the experience of the Uawa was integral to this meeting. We've heard enough in these 3 days to know that we could use science, intellectualism, scholarship, the humanities, far better than we have to advance New Zealand, and we need to be collective and not rely on a few people to achieve that change. Kia ora. Now, it would be totally inappropriate as a person who came into this process because of a tragedy affecting a person we know to have the last word. So the last word is coming from Paul.
I don't think the fact that I've suddenly had to face the prospect of an early death has really changed the way that I look at the world. That's been surprising to me. I think that's the first thing, that it hasn't shaken the sort of understandings that I had prior to suddenly facing this new personal situation. It's the whole matter of mortality is what makes life so remarkable, and that's the paradox. What's remarkable at the age in which we live is that there has never been change at quite the rate that is happening now in the history of this planet. The human understanding of the universe is just increasing at an enormous rate, and it's not going to slow down, it's only going to accelerate. There's no sense in which scientific knowledge comes to an end. It just goes on, and as we learn more and more, we learn there's more and more to be understood, and it's like peeling away layers of an onion. There's just more layers underneath, and it's an endless journey. So the metaphor of the journey, the compass point, the transit of Venus represents as a point to take stock, a point to look at what's happened, to look ahead, and to see that as a waypoint, if you like, on a journey. Before that knowledge that science gave us, in the agricultural age for 3,000 years, we had a natural population on Earth of the order of a few hundred million. You know, when I was born, it was 2.5 billion. Now it's over 6.5 billion. And that's only become possible because science and technology have given us the capacity to allow more humans to eat and to feed them, to clothe themselves and to transport themselves and to live here. But at the same time, it's impacting on the planet because of our finite resources. And how do we manage that? How do we control them? How do we control population growth? How do we utilise energy in a way that's sustainable and doesn't damage the biosphere? There's no way of us finding the solution to those problems without the knowledge of science. So science has created, in a sense, created the problem by enabling us to so many to live, but it's got to be the solution by which we learn to live sustainably. I mean, if nature had its way, we would have, with agriculture anyway, a few 100 million people. What are we saying here? Do we want to kill off 97% of the human population in order to go back to a world where women died in childbirth and people had a life expectancy of 35, 40, where we were completely the victim of infection, of wounds, of that life was nasty, brutish and short? And so science challenges our humanity, and we have to make decisions as human beings as to where do our human values fit in terms of this new possibility that science puts in our hands. And so there's always going to be this challenge between humanity and science in a process which requires the scientists to be as open and as communicative and as honest as possible, presenting the challenges, and we as citizens have to make the decision about how we use it. So it's a very important dialogue. It's going to be increasingly important to the future, the way we are challenged in our humanity by the potential technologies and new knowledge that science brings, and how we use that, what decisions we make around it. My own view is that knowledge is valuable to us, but it challenges us to be wise. I mean, what else is the purpose of life? Why are we here? I mean, what is the reason for our existence if it's not to gain some sort of wisdom? Isn't that why we are on this journey of from birth to death? Otherwise, there's no point. We have to take charge of our future. We've already assumed responsibility for the welfare of our planet, whether we like it or not. We are having an impact on planet Earth. We have no choice, and if we're to survive, we must do that. And we will, because there is a love that exists in humankind that is universal to all our cultures, and love is such a power, and it drives us onward, it gives us hope, it makes us care for one another, and it makes us think of the future, and it's really why we're here. And the thought that we could lose that, that humanity might not survive to retain such ideas as love, is unthinkable.
So it's about love.
It's about love. It is about love. And I think that love surpasses all understanding. And that is the mystery of love, and that's the ultimate aim of humanity.
ake amine te atua te peringa tōku oranga e honore e kororia maumarongo ki te whenua whakaro wahie ki ngā tangata katoa ake amine te atua te peringa tōku oranga tōku oranga tōku oranga.
Koe no kia ora tātou, tēnā koutou ka tau nei ki roto I tēnei o ngā whare, tēnei te mihi atu, mai te hunga, te tangata whenua kia koutou, no reira tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou. Greetings from the tangata whenua of this area. First of all to Hauiti and those of our relations, and we of our area support them in what they're doing. And our belief and expectation is that they will transpose that to our schools in our area. Rera koe ora te koutou, and we like to thank you for gracing us with your presence in this city of Gisborne. And sort of just as a word from my fellow clergymen, and I think the Bible tells us the fear of God is the beginning of wisdom. So you don't know everything, so ask God when you can. Kia ora tātou, a ke kati heo tō tātou hui. Ai ho nore he koro ria ki te atua mona mau ngā ronga ki rungi te whenua he whakaaro pai ki ngā tāngata katoa. Āmene. E I hoa koe ni rā mātou I tuku atu nei a mātou whakamoi meti atu ki a koe. Mo eni o pono koe I whakawhaiti hea runga tēni o nā whare. I noi atu nei ki a koe e I hoa ke mnāki a mai hoki rātau e hoki nei runga te huarai ki tēnā ki tona kāinga, tēnā ki tona whānau, tēnā ki no tona hapu tona iwi hoki. A ke haere koe mui a rātau ke tapatahi ai o rātau ngā kautapai atu ki a koe. No te mea ko kōre rutia koe ao me ngaro mai rāno o te tīmatanga o te ao. Ke mahara rātau ki ao kupu kei tūtaki o rā mātou. O rātou ngā kauta kupu whakatuma, ko koe koe hoa, hei arataki, hei tohi a rātou ngā wā katoa, gloria ki tō ingoa tapu. Amen. May God bless you all. Kia ora tata.
No, I know. I've been meaning to over the last couple of days.